During an interview last week, Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan addressed the Uyghur situation in China, saying China is not committing human rights abuses. Let's watch.
There is a lot of criticism about the treatment of Uyghurs by China in the West. But our ambassador went there, Moinul Haq, who's our ambassador in China. We asked him, and he went there and he sent us information that this is actually not true on the ground. But what we in Pakistan find it very difficult to swallow is that while they talk about Uyghurs, they do not talk much in the West about Kashmir. Because in Kashmir, the worst violations of human rights are taking place by India. And somehow there is selective silence about human rights in Kashmir.
So human rights organizations in Western countries claim that there have been substantial human rights abuses. I'm sure you've heard about this. There's a lot of discussion about it in the news, talking about mass detention, torture, forced labor, and genocide, as well as even sterilization, telling people that they can't have many more children than they already have, or potentially maybe any at all. So all of these reports have been going on, and people are claiming that this is happening in the Xinjiang region of China. And this is something that the Pakistan Prime Minister, and remember, Pakistan being a Muslim majority country, the Pakistan Prime Minister has denied this. And the Pakistan Prime Minister is not alone. In late 2020, Cuba's UN representative Ana Silva Rodriguez Abascal read a statement on behalf of 45 countries in defense of Chinese policies. And the statement applauded the Chinese government and said, quote, "On Xinjiang-related issues, it is imperative to respect the basic facts rather than making unfounded allegations against China and interfere out of political motivations and bias," which is what I'm going to be addressing once we kind of get through a little bit more of some of the facts here. So she did also read 45 countries. She named 45 countries who support China, including many Muslim majority countries such as Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Morocco, Pakistan, Palestine. Interesting to mention Palestine because a lot of people compare the Uyghur situation to Palestine, but Palestine's in support of China on this one, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So another thing about this, before we kind of talk more about the details of what's actually going on there, even the Associated Press actually reported that many of the camps are gone. They came out with this report in October saying 4 years after Beijing launched a brutal crackdown that swept up to 1 million or more Uyghurs and other mostly Muslim minorities into detention camps and prisons, its control of Xinjiang has entered a new era. Chinese authorities have scaled back many of the most draconian and visible aspects of the region's high-tech police state. The panic that gripped the region a few years ago has subsided considerably, and a sense of normality is creeping back in. So that is really important because no matter what you think was actually going on in the Xinjiang region against the Uyghurs, whether you believe that it was this horrific genocide and the bodies have been burned, whether you think it was a cultural genocide and they're being forced out of their natural culture and told that they have to be more Chinese, or whether you think that this wasn't actually happening at all. No matter what you think of the situation, the Associated Press was on the ground with investigative journalists, and they found that the camps aren't there. So there's no reason at this point anymore. You could point at it and say that was atrocious, that should have never happened, but you can't say, hey, we need to boycott any products that are being made in the Xinjiang region, or we need to boycott the Olympics in China. I know that's what's going on. We need to boycott China because of what's happening. And so therefore we need to boycott them to get them to stop. According to the Associated Press, they've stopped. So this was something that went on for reportedly 4 years. Now, China's side of the story, as well as many of these Muslim majority nations, is that China was being forced to repatriate Chinese citizens who were Uyghurs that went off to fight with al-Qaeda. So they had a real problem for a long time. Many of the Uyghurs were being recruited to go fight with extremist organizations such as al-Qaeda. Now, when you really look into the history of this, China was somewhat at fault for this because China actually brought in this more extreme version of Islam. So this would be Salafist or Wahhabism, whatever you want to call it, but a very extreme sort of, I don't even want to call it fundamentalist. I mean, that's kind of a way to describe it so that people can understand. But if you ask actual people who do study more fundamental Islam. They'll say this isn't even fundamental. This is just a deviation completely. It's a perversion. So China sort of encouraged the bringing in of this sort of perversion or radical Islam into their Xinjiang region. And the reason why they did this back in the 70s and 80s was for the same reason the United States was encouraging Saudi Arabia to also export this form of Islam around various parts of the Middle East and into Afghanistan in particular, and the Mujahideen and the support that the United States gave to the Mujahideen. And that was to stop the Soviets. So China also wanted to stop the Soviets at the time. And they thought an enemy of my enemy is my friend. Wrong. We've learned this lesson the hard way as well. When we were funding and helping the Mujahideen, of course, then turned into both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Big problem, right? So you can trace this history back to China being the problem. You can also say for sure that China is problematic in that China treated the Uyghurs like second-class citizens, and that is what that is what they were treated as second-class citizens. They were impoverished, and when people are feeling this way, when they're feeling down, when the boot's on their neck, they go and seek relief somewhere. And so that is another reason why so many Uyghurs were able to be recruited by these extremist organizations, because they promised them a better life, and China was keeping them down. So a lot of this is definitely China's fault, and you can absolutely trace it back to them. But the fact remains is that many of these people, thousands and thousands of Uyghurs, were recruited out of the Xinjiang region into these extremist organizations. They fought in Al-Qaeda against the U.S., against Russia, against NATO, and they were fighting in Al-Qaeda. Now, when these wars started to ramp down, as Al-Qaeda started to lose, a lot of these fighters were going back home. This is something the United States doesn't have to deal with. There are other countries that have to deal with this more than we do. We luckily have not had this problem. We don't have Americans recruited en masse to go and fight for Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and then they have to come home, and we're like, what do we do with these people, right? China had that problem. These are Chinese citizens. They have to come home. They're now China's problem. China then said, okay, they're our problem. These fighters are coming back. But not only are the fighters coming back, but China's saying it's not just the fighter, it's also their family. The family supports this ideology. The family, their children, their spouses, their parents. It's not just the fighter who went off because that was a young man, 20 years old, going off to fight on the battlefield. It's a cultural, systemic issue inside of the Xinjiang region. So China decided to do this crackdown, this de-radicalization crackdown. And that is when several years ago, maybe 5 years ago, they opened up these camps and they started to attempt to de-radicalize the fighters, and not only the fighters, but their families as well. And anyone who looked like they were supporting this sort of more radical ideology, they then swept them all up and put them into prisons where they re-educated them. So they're trying to brainwash them out of what they consider them being brainwashed. And I think many of us would consider people that are going off to fight for Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of these sorts of organizations, we would say, maybe they're a bit brainwashed. So I guess they're re-brainwashing the brainwashed, however you want to think of it. So the issue now, why are we talking about this? Why do we need to defend China against these human rights abuses? Why would this even be discussed? Like, why can't we just agree it was a genocide, it was horrible, and move on with our lives? Well, first of all, because this narrative that is being out there, that what you could absolutely criticize, sweeping up people because they believe something and putting them in prison is wrong. We don't do that in this country. We believe in freedom of religion. I believe you have the right to believe in this radical form of Islam, just like I believe you have the right to believe in radical forms of Christianity. You have the right to believe that. It's when you act on it that I begin to have a problem with it. So we could criticize China completely for rounding these people up for their beliefs and putting them in a prison. Now, some of them they should have rounded up because they were fighters from Al-Qaeda, and they, of course, should go and be in prison. Probably China's, and there still are. Many of them are still in prison. China hasn't let out. I don't think the fighters are being let out. So you could criticize that, but to escalate the rhetoric to genocide and to say, they're committing this this genocide, which is a very charged, that's war talk. That's warmongering talk. And that is the problem with it. And that is why we have to be very careful about that rhetoric, because we don't want to allow the military industrial complex more ammo, literally and figuratively, to continue building up their weaponry. We need our tax dollars to go back to building America. We want the money to strengthen our country rather than building up these military weapon, tons of weapons and building up the military industrial complex more than it already is. So the narrative matters. The rhetoric matters. We should instead just say, hey, we believe in human rights. We believe in the freedom of religion. You should not be rounding people up and putting them in jail for their religious beliefs, unless you absolutely can see and you have evidence and you've given them due process to prove that these people not only believed what they believed, but were dangerous, potentially dangerous, or were dangerous, or did commit acts of terror because of their beliefs. Fine. You treat it as such. You go to court and you prove your case. So that is why this rhetoric matters so much. And look, there are a lot of problems with China. We could criticize many, many things. They are not a free country. They don't believe in democracy like we do here in this country. They have heavy surveillance. They heavily surveil the Uyghurs. They have committed privacy violations on the Uyghur people. They have committed surveillance and heavy hand on them. I mean, absolutely a dystopian nightmare that I would not want to live under. And that's what we should be criticizing them for. Now, the sterilization issue is interesting because people say, well, they're sterilizing the Uyghurs, and so therefore that is genocide. It's not just cultural, because remember, the narrative switched from genocide, and then people said, well, where are the bodies and where are the refugees? You kind of need that if you're going to say it's a genocide. And then people said, well, no, it's a cultural genocide. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, they are eradicating their religion, which they are only eradicating the extreme version of Islam. So you can't wear a niqab, which is the full covering for women. Men can't wear the long beards. You can absolutely be a Muslim in China. There's plenty of Muslims outside of the Uyghur region, but you can't practice this particular form of Islam. So a cultural genocide, saying that they're then eradicating their language? Well, it's true. Uyghur children, when they go to school, they're taught Mandarin Chinese. The reason for that is so that they can participate in the economy, so that they can participate in the country. I don't see anything wrong with that. I'm the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants, and when I went to school in America, I learned English. They didn't teach me Vietnamese. I think that's fair enough. So we should be focusing more on, so then when we got to this rhetoric of, well, it's a cultural genocide, then when you point out it's not really a cultural genocide, you're left with what it actually is. And that is what we should be actually criticizing it so that we don't adopt that same sort of culture here in this country. And we're starting to, right, with censorship. We're starting to with conform to my morality or else. And that is what we should be screaming our heads off about. We should be absolutely for freedoms for people, freedom to practice religion, freedom to think what you want to think, freedom to express your dissent, freedom of all of these things that many of the people in China are not given. And that is a fair criticism. But ramping up this warmongery rhetoric is not helpful. It isn't helpful for our international relations. We're ultimately going to have to work with China. They are rising to be the new world power, whether we like it or not. And we're going to have to contend with that. We also need to be competing with them economically rather than just trying to warmonger and try to pick a fight and try to debilitate them through war. We're only going to also debilitate ourselves in that way. So rhetoric matters, truth matters, reality matters, criticizing them for what is worth criticizing matters, and refraining from criticizing them for things that we have no evidence of, that are not actually reality, but are just buying into the warmongering rhetoric. We need to be careful of that. So that is why it matters. That is why we should care. That is what's really going on. Love hearing from you. If you have any comments, questions, you can email me, kim@kimiversen.com. I'm going to have more to say on this subject. I'm sure this is just one little segment of many on the topic. But please comment, questions, email those in to me. Also, please join my locals community. This is where you can also talk more about these types of things. We do casual live streams. Going to be doing some happy hours on locals, so be sure to check it out there. And also my Rumble channel. I do have content there that I am not posting on YouTube, so be sure to check out my Rumble channel. You can see right there, there's a segment that is not on YouTube. You can only find that on Rumble or on Rockfin, which is another one of my channels. You do have to be, for my content on Rockfin, you have to be a paid subscriber. But Rumble, you can go and watch for free. But both platforms are great, so be sure to check that out. Thank you guys so much for watching. And again, email me, comments, questions, kim@kimiversen.com.